Bradford, Center for Policy Research and an Energy and Environment seminar series. And I'm thrilled to welcome back one of our own, David Kanter, who's now a professor, assistant professor at NYU. He graduated with his PhD from the STEP program from my group, actually, in 2014, where he did his first work on nitrogen in agriculture, nitrogen use efficiency, and socioeconomic, scientific, and policy mechanisms for reducing excess nitrogen and improving nitrogen use efficiency in agriculture. He came to us from Bristol University in the United Kingdom, where he had done his undergraduate degree jointly in chemistry and law. And after he graduated from Princeton, he went on to a postdoc at Columbia University at the Earth Institute, and from there did his position at New York University as an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies Department, which is a new department which is still growing and hiring faculty at this point. His work has a central question asking, how can we feed 10 billion people sustainably? His work has a big focus still on nitrogen, pollution, food security, and sustainable development. Today he'll talk to us about a paper of his, and joined with Tim Searchinger, who's a research scholar in the STEP program, looking at work that he's done on taking a technological approach to reducing nitrogen pollution, something analogous to CAFE fuel efficiency standards. And the paper just came out a few days ago in Nature Sustainability, so the timing is perfect. Welcome back, David. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you so much, Denise. It really is a pleasure to be back here. It feels like home. I used to come to these seminars every Monday and get here at 11:45 to make sure I had the choice of sandwiches. So it's a pleasure to be back here and an honor to be on this side of the podium this time. So today I'm going to be talking about new policy dimensions for nitrogen. And the central takeaway, if there's one thing you come away from this talk with, it's that we need to be more creative when it comes to coming up with solutions to address this problem of nitrogen pollution. The current solutions that we have, or the current policy approaches we have, are insufficient, are not matched to the scale of the problem that we have. Right? So I like to first summarize my talk in one slide. So again, if there's just one slide that you remember from this talk, it's this one. Nitrogen is both essential to life and a major environmental problem. Right? And it kind of neatly encapsulates the central challenge of sustainable development, both improving human well-being while minimizing environmental degradation. Nitrogen policies, when it comes to pollution, predominantly nitrogen pollution comes from agriculture. 2/3 of it come from agriculture. We'll go into a bit more depth about that. And so as a result, most nitrogen policies that try to address the agricultural sector obviously focus on farmers. But as we'll see, a policy focus on farmers is usually quite difficult to do and is usually ineffective. And so that was one of the spurs for looking beyond the farmer focus. And so Tim Searchinger and I started having conversations a couple of years ago, well, what other actors in the agricultural supply chain could you focus on to perhaps change and reduce nitrogen pollution in the agricultural sector? And the CAFE standards, which are the vehicle fuel efficiency standards in the United States that force improvements in fuel efficiency. We used those as an inspiration and asked ourselves, well, what would that look like if we applied them to the fertilizer industry? Right? We needed to explore other options given the severity of the problem. And the reason we started looking at the CAFE standards is because environmental policy is often successful when at least two conditions are met. That the parties that are regulated are usually pretty small in number, and that those same parties can potentially profit from the regulation. Right? We saw that with the Montreal Protocol and DuPont. We saw that with the pesticides story and the Stockholm Convention. I'll go into a bit more detail about that. Right? So we look at what the CAFE standards would look like if they were applied to the fertilizer industry, a much smaller number of actors than farmers. And specifically, we look at how it could potentially spur innovation in the conservative sector. The fertilizer industry is not an industry known for its innovation. Right? And so this kind of policy where you're forcing technology change could be a way to spur innovation in an otherwise conservative sector. And we look at this through the lens of a particular case study in the US corn sector, specifically at the acreage there that is excessively applying nitrogen. And we estimate that you could get a net economic benefit for farmers, industry, and the environment of $5 to $8 billion by 2030. This is just a primary case, an initial case study exploring this idea. So this is just a summary of what I'm going to talk about, and I'll go into each of them in a bit more detail. So let's start with just the fact that nitrogen, what is nitrogen and why are we talking about it? Right? It's essential to life. It's the building blocks of amino acids, proteins. It fuels photosynthesis. Life would be impossible without it. Right? The problem is that over 99% of the nitrogen on this planet is in a form that is unavailable to over 99% of the organisms that need it, because it's held together by this very strong triple bond in the atmosphere, right? N2. And before we came along, by we I mean humanity, there are only a couple of ways that that bond could be broken, right? Either by lightning or by nitrogen fixation, right? Certain microorganisms in oceans and in terrestrial ecosystems that can break that triple bond. And that's really important to note because that bond was so difficult to break, it created limits to growth, right? To how much we could grow, to how much food we could produce, and thus how many people the planet could support, right? And that dynamic, the kind of limits to growth, were changed fundamentally by the invention of the HaberBosch process. The HaberBosch process, created about 100 years ago now, was the combination of nitrogen and hydrogen to make ammonia. And the HaberBosch process is the industrial production of ammonia, which is the feedstock for every nitrogen fertilizer out there. And suddenly we had an unlimited supply of nitrogen that we could use to produce food to support the planet. And the invention of the HaberBosch process and the expansion in the use of synthetic fertilizer, particularly after the Second World War, fueled global population growth. On a separate note, there's a really interesting recent Radiolab episode on Fritz Haber. Very conflicted man. You should check it out. It's very interesting. Anyway, this is one of my favorite figures that kind of encapsulates the impact that the HaberBosch process, which I think is one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. There's a lot going on in this figure. I'll just quickly walk you through it, but I think it's important to understand how fundamentally transformative the HaberBosch process was and ultimately led to this nitrogen pollution problem that we're experiencing today. So this solid black line here is just global population growth over the 20th century. So you can see we went from about just under 2 billion people at the turn of the last century to now obviously over 7 billion today. Right? This dashed red line is what these authors estimate global population would have been without the HaberBosch process. Right? How much population could have been supported with food production minus synthetic fertilizer. Another way to put it, which is this dashed black line, this is the proportion of the world's population supported with food that's grown using HaberBosch nitrogen. So today, about half of the world's population would not be here were it not for the HaberBosch process. We can argue whether that's a positive or a negative thing, but it's a thing. What do you mean, which one? Sorry. Oh, well, we can take a vote afterwards if you want, Tim. But and then here, obviously, one of the fueling parts of this is then the increase in fertilizer application per hectare, which is this blue line here. So this massive increase in the amount of fertilizer that's applied per hectare. This little dip here is the fall of the Soviet Union. And then I can guarantee you it takes off again as China and India start applying more at the turn of this most current century. And then this green line is the increase in meat consumption per capita over the past few decades, right? Because as GDP growth continues and as more and more countries bring their populations out of poverty, meat consumption tends to rise, right? So this, in one quite complicated graph, shows you the impact that the HaberBosch process has had on our planet and why I think it warrants the award of probably the most consequential invention of the 20th century, right? This has resulted in a major disturbance of the Earth's nitrogen cycle, right? It's a natural cycle that has been supplemented by additional nitrogen that we've put into the system, right? So today we have about half of the nitrogen that's created every year, that's fixed every year, I should say, from the atmosphere, so where that triple bond is broken, is from natural sources, right? So from lightning, volcanoes, or nitrogen fixation. And then the other half is from human fixation, right? From either the HaberBosch process or from the combustion of fossil fuels, right? So we have, through our activities, doubled the amount of new reactive nitrogen, which is nitrogen that is not in this N2 form, that's introduced into the system every year. That's a huge perturbation of a element cycle, right? So this obviously has implications, right? We can't just double the amount of nitrogen being, new amount of nitrogen being put into natural and human systems every year without there being some consequences to it. And the fact is that, yes, nitrogen is essential to global food production, but we often over-apply it. We often don't use it very efficiently, right? So this map shows you the excess nitrogen applied to major cereals around the world, right, in kilograms per hectare. Now, some excess is inevitable, right, if you want to be a responsible farmer. You might just apply a little bit more nitrogen as insurance because you're not quite sure what the weather or the climate's going to be that year, right? So you can perhaps forgive up to maybe 50 kilos nitrogen extra per hectare. But when you get into the excesses of 100 and beyond 200, that's where it's not just about an insurance policy. It's huge over-application of nitrogen, which generates these pollution problems, because when there is excess nitrogen on the soil, it doesn't get taken up by crops. Some of it gets recycled in the soil, but the bulk of it gets lost to the environment. And it gets lost in a variety of forms, right? So nitrogen has this variety of environmental impacts. So this is actually a publication that both Professor Masrol and I were involved in one of my first years at Princeton. It was a report for the US climate assessment, specifically on nitrogen and climate. And one of the things they were looking at is when nitrogen leaves the soil, when it's lost to the environment, what forms is it lost in? There's still quite a bit of uncertainty. This is just for the US. But what I want to highlight to you is that it's lost in a variety of forms, right? There's hydrologic ends, so when nitrogen is leached into waterways, and that generally leads to, for example, dead zones, eutrophication in the Gulf of Mexico. Ammonia and NOx, two very important air pollutants. And then nitrous oxide, the third most important greenhouse gas and the largest remaining threat to the ozone layer. And then part of it is returned to the atmosphere as N2, and then there's a large part that is still unknown. And what makes nitrogen both really interesting from a scientific perspective, but really tricky from a policy one, is that once nitrogen is out of the atmosphere as N2, it can really easily transition between these other forms. So when nitrogen gets lost from the farm, it can have a multitude of environmental impacts. And that dynamic is known as the nitrogen cascade. You don't have to follow everything that's going on in the soil here, but the story I want to just briefly say with this slide is, let's say you apply nitrogen as fertilizer here, right? And let's say it initially gets lost, emitted as ammonia, right, where it contributes to air pollution. That same atom of nitrogen that was initially applied as fertilizer, then transformed into ammonia, can get transformed yet again and deposited onto a waterway as nitrate, where it impacts water quality, right? Contributes to dead zones. That same atom of nitrogen that's already cycled through ammonium and nitrate then can get further transformed to nitrous oxide. Gets emitted to the atmosphere as the third most abundantly emitted greenhouse gas and the largest remaining threat to the ozone layer. So one atom of nitrogen can have a multitude of environmental impacts. That's the negative side. The kind of positive spin on it is if you use nitrogen more efficiently, right, if you don't have half of the nitrogen that you apply being lost to the environment, you can get a multitude of co-benefits, right? So you don't just get air and benefits or water quality benefits or climate benefits or ozone benefits. You get a whole suite of them if you use the right mitigation strategies. My final kind of introductory part to this before I get to the meat of the paper that Tim and I were doing is that nitrogen has been highlighted as one of the more important environmental issues of our time. This is one of the more iconic figures of the past 5 years or so in environmental science. Some people love it, some people hate it, but this is essentially a pie of environmental catastrophe, and each wedge in this pie is a specific environmental issue, right? And what we want is to stay within this safe green zone. That's a safe level of human interference with these environmental problems. And anywhere we'll be beyond that in the yellow and red zone is not good, right? And you can see there are two issues where we have gone definitely into the red zone. One is biodiversity loss, right? Biosphere integrity, fancy way of talking about biodiversity loss, and specifically genetic diversity, so the number of species. And the other, biochemical flows, phosphorus and nitrogen, right? We are way beyond a safe planetary boundary, according to these authors, which means that we are beyond the level of human interference at which damage then becomes perhaps irreparable and permanent. So how do you address this problem? Right? How can you start to get the nitrogen problem under control? Because it's an essential resource. We still need to use it. Right? So how do you get it under control? Well, at its core, at least from an agricultural perspective, you need to increase nitrogen use efficiency. Basically, you need to get more out from what you put in. Right? You need to produce more food from the nitrogen that you put into the system. Right? And so you want to increase the yield response curve. Right? So the yield response curve is called that because it measures how yield responds to nitrogen inputs. Right? So this is your standard, the A, what's marked A here is your standard yield response curve. Right? So this is yield on the y-axis, fertilizer on the x-axis. As you add more fertilizer, your yield increases, and then at a certain point it stops, it plateaus out. Right? If you improve nitrogen management, you can get increases in nitrogen use efficiency, and we'll talk about those. There are a variety of ways that you can actually improve this yield response curve. You can improve the type of seeds, the crop varieties that you're using, and so depending on what strategy you use, you can either increase where the y-intercept is, or you increase the slope of the curve. And we're specifically going to look at nitrogen management strategies, so specifically that increase the slope of the curve. They may not affect the y-intercept here. Right? So in terms of nitrogen management strategies, there are really two ways that you can improve or address nitrogen pollution, improve nitrogen management. I would lump them in kind of behavioral and technical strategies. So behavioral is all about how do you apply existing fertilizer products more efficiently. Right? So your ureas, your ammonium nitrates, these fertilizer products that have been around for decades, how do you use those same products more efficiently? So one example of this would be GPS technology that shows you where in your field there is more nitrogen need than another, so you can actually be more precise. This comes under the kind of umbrella of precision agriculture. You can be more precise in how and where you apply your nitrogen. You can also split up your nitrogen over the course of the growing season, so you don't just apply it in one big dump at the beginning of the growing season, but you actually split it up over the course of the growing season. So these are all practices over using existing products more efficiently. And then there are these technical solutions where they are, instead of farmers necessarily changing their behavior, you're actually changing the product that they're applying. Right? So these are under kind of the rubric, you call them enhanced efficiency fertilizers. And there you're actually changing the fertilizer product. Okay, so this is an example of one of them, probably the most widely used of these environmentally, enhanced efficiency fertilizers. This is environmentally smart nitrogen from one of the biggest fertilizer companies in the world, Nutrien. It's recently created as a result of a merger of Agrium and Potash Corp. And there they coat fertilizer with a polymer that dissolves over the course of the growing season in response to temperature and moisture in the soil, and it better synchronizes when nitrogen is in the soil and when plants actually need it. So it reduces the amount of excess nitrogen in the soil. And both these kind of practices, both the behavioral and the technical kind of ways to address nitrogen management, are all about better synchronizing nitrogen supply and demand in the soil, right? And making sure that nitrogen is there when plants actually need it, and so that there's less nitrogen that is susceptible to be lost to the environment. Okay, great. But so you have these solutions, right? You have these approaches for reducing nitrogen pollution. But the real question is, do farmers actually use them? Right? Are they actually being adopted in any real way by farmers? So this was the result of a survey of farmers in southern Michigan. this was one question of the farmer's use of pre-side-race soil nitrate tests, was just a fancy way of asking them, do you check for how much nitrogen is in your soil every year before you apply nitrogen? That's a really useful kind of indicator of how much nitrogen you should supply for the following year, right? So do they do these kind of tests? 5% do it for all acres every year. Just over 10% do it for some acres, some years. Some have done it in the past, but not now. And the overwhelming majority have never done something like this. Similarly, with these, what they call delayed release products, so the enhanced efficiency fertilizers that I was talking about, 10% of them use it on a routine basis. A few more use it sometimes or experimented with use, but the overwhelming majority of them have never used these products. Right? So even though these solutions exist to address nitrogen pollution, they're not widely used at all. So
this is weighted on the vertical scale, weighted in the size of the user, not just counting farmers equally big or small.
That would be my guess, based on acreage, yeah. So the question is why, right? Well, it's not a surprise to know that implementing policy in the agricultural sector is first quite difficult to do, particularly environmental policy, because it's typically pollution from agriculture is diffuse, right? It's difficult to monitor. Then you have the fact that farmers are typically quite a powerful political lobby, right? The average age of a farmer in the United States is 58. No offense to that generation, but you're not exactly going to be a first mover when it comes to technology, you know, or adopt new practices and technologies from that point of view. And almost all environmental policy in the agricultural sector is voluntary, is incentive-based. There's no mandatory environmental policy, or very little mandatory environmental policy for farmers. And then there are a couple of other challenges, too, when it comes to specifically the nitrogen issue. One is that it's this essential resource, right? So you can't talk about completely phasing out nitrogen use. That's not what we want. It's central to food production. We need to talk about increasing the efficiency with which we use it, which is a more challenging, nuanced conversation. And also because nitrogen has these multiple environmental impacts, from air quality to water quality to climate change, ozone depletion, it cuts across a lot of environmental issues. And that's not typically how we've organized most of our environmental policy. We, in this country, have a Clean Air Act, a Clean Water Act. We have certain policies devoted to climate change, other policies devoted to ozone depletion. We don't generally try to organize environmental policy in a kind of cross-impact way, which is what the kind of problem that nitrogen is. Right? If you look at a federal level, this is from our paper now. This is from USDA surveys, so this is a national level now. So surveys of farmers at the national level over time, and the percentage of these farmers, specifically in the corn sector now, because they are the most they use the most nitrogen, they apply the most nitrogen, they're the most nitrogen-intensive sector in the United States. The percentage of farmers that either use a soil nitrogen test, that use a nitrogen inhibitor, which is one of these enhanced efficiency fertilizers, that have a nitrogen management plan, or do these plant tissue tests. So all measures to address nitrogen pollution. You can see that there's really no trend here, right? That they haven't really either, depending on where you start looking or where you stop, and sometimes there isn't data available, like with the nitrogen management plan. And they're about to release data for 2016, and I've been told that essentially that these the trends have continued. There's no upward tick in the adoption of any of these nitrogen management tools, right? So farmers are not increasing their use of nitrogen management tools, even though funding for a lot of these programs that try to incentivize farmers to do so has increased. It increased under the Obama administration. And more importantly, pollution levels haven't decreased. They've kind of stayed stubbornly stable, right? So, for example, US agricultural nitrous oxide emissions, that's down here, have increased about 7% since 2005. NOx emissions have increased from agriculture by 20%. Agricultural ammonia has increased by 10%. This is all from 2005. And then these nitrate levels are just from the Mississippi River basin, because first there isn't data for the entire United States and it wouldn't have fit on this graph so nicely, but it's just to give you a sense that nitrogen pollution is really not budging, right? And it's, if anything, it's increasing slightly even as we are slowly increasing our nitrogen use efficiency in this country. And the focus has been, as I've said, on farmers, typically, and it makes sense, right? If agriculture is the dominant source of nitrogen pollution and farmer decision-making is what's ultimately causing nitrogen pollution, then you'd want to have policies focused on farmers as well. But the fact is that there are other actors in the agricultural supply chain that can do things or that can implement policies or certain practices that could also affect how farmers use nitrogen, right? So this is from a paper that's still under review, but it just shows you the agricultural, the main actors in the agricultural supply chain when it comes to nitrogen. And today, specifically, we're focusing on the fertilizer industry, right? So what about the fertilizer industry? It's highly concentrated, right? In contrast to the couple of million or so farmers that we have in this country, right? 84% of, and I'm sorry that the font is a bit small here, but essentially what you can see is that 84% of North American urea and ammonia production capacity, which is the main nitrogen fertilizers products, are controlled by 5 companies, right? 2 companies control 64% of the market, right? And if there is really one of the main lessons of successful environmental policy, I would argue, it's that environmental policy tends to be successful when the parties that are regulated can also profit from the regulation. Now, why would they be able to profit from the regulation? Why would they be able to make money from it? Well, they'd be able to do it if they also controlled the market for alternatives, right? If they produced products that could thrive in an environment that was committed to improving nitrogen management. And when you actually look at the products and the services offered by these companies, most of them offer these kind of services or products, right? So these are the 5 companies that were listed in the previous pie chart, the market share that they have in North America. And 4 out of the 5 produce either a product, so this is the name of the product and the type, or they produce a service. So what do I mean by that? Essentially, intelligence for the farmer to be able to apply their nitrogen more efficiently. So for example, the GPS technology that allows them to see more clearly where the nitrogen deficiencies are in their field. But so 4 of the 5 companies produce either a product or a service that could help improve nitrogen management. They're currently a niche part of the market. There isn't the demand from farmers, right? Because I would argue there also hasn't been the policy forcing to increase the demand for these kind of products and services, right? And I can't really, those of you who knew me when I was here as a grad student, I can't get through a presentation at Princeton without talking about the Montreal Protocol and the ozone story. But there are similarities here because DuPont was one of those companies that profited from regulation because they controlled the market for alternatives, right? They were the major producer of CFCs, which were the main culprit in ozone depletion, but they were also the main producer of HCFCs and HFCs, which were the main alternatives CFCs that were patent protected. They could charge a premium for, and they could actually profit from a global level playing field as a result of the Montreal Protocol. Similarly, the pesticide story. Pretty much every major pesticide company was in favor of the initial Stockholm Convention because all the pesticides that were controlled, the patents had run out. Most of them were banned in the United States, and a global convention on pesticides created a global level playing field for these companies to introduce their alternatives. Right? And there's a similar dynamic, I think, with fertilizer. Right? There is a potential market opportunity. Currently, they're niche products. Right? They used these enhanced efficiency fertilizers, these management techniques. They're used on some farms, but primarily, I would say, fruits, vegetables, golf courses. They're used by farms or by places that can actually afford them, right? And so how would you expand the use of these products, right? How could you make them affordable to farmers? How would you encourage fertilizer industry or mandate fertilizer industry to increase their production? And that's where we look to the CAFE standards, the fuel efficiency standards, right? So what are these standards? The CAFE standards are regulations that were passed back in the 1970s in response to the Arab oil embargo in 1973. Right? There was a fear then that about U.S. dependence on foreign oil, and particularly oil from the Middle East. And so they wanted to try and reduce that dependence, and one way they could do that was by making cars more fuel efficient, right? Meaning that they could drive longer with the same tank of gas. And it was based on a very simple idea. And the idea was that it's easier to regulate a small handful of big actors than about 100 million small actors. Right? That's the basic idea. That instead of forcing 100 million drivers to drive 10,000 miles a year, and if you drive 10,001, we're going to fine you, instead regulating the 6 to 10 auto manufacturers in the United States, smaller at the time, and saying, you need to increase the fuel efficiency of your cars by X amount by this date. Right? This policy was then adopted by President Obama as a centerpiece of his climate policy, because if you increase the fuel efficiency of cars, often you also get a reduction in CO2 emissions. Right? And it forced technology development. Right? It forced companies to develop more fuel-efficient cars. And that policy forced it to move, forced the industry to move at a rate that was arguably quicker than natural market forces could have created. Right? Obviously, I should also mention that this figure was created before the current administration. They have made undoing the CAFE standards a central point of their environmental policy. And so this might look different in a few years. So the CAFE standards. I'm just going to briefly describe some of the central tenets of these standards, because it's important when thinking about how we might apply them to the fertilizer and nitrogen problem. So they're flexible. There's a credit mechanism so that if a company doesn't comply, can't make its whole fleet be this particular level of fuel efficiency, it can buy credits from another company that has in order to comply. And it used to be able to average these fuel efficiency standards across its entire fleet. It can't do that anymore, but it might actually be a useful tool when it comes to fertilizer. Compliance. About 15 to 20% of cars were independently, models of cars were independently tested in EPA labs to make sure that they were actually achieving the fuel efficiency standards that they said they were. Now, obviously, there was the big Volkswagen scandal, so this wasn't a foolproof process, but for the most part, it worked. And then they had penalties for every mile per gallon that you were over the fuel efficiency standard, which ended up being raised to $14 for every mile per gallon you were over. I have the number here. Over the period 1983 to 2012, manufacturers paid over $870 million in penalties in compliance. So this was an important enforcement mechanism. And then it drove innovation, right? A recent paper suggested that for every 1% increase in the CAFE standards, it increased innovation by an additional 0.3%. So we define that as improvement in fuel economy related technologies if vehicle weight and engine power are kept constant. Right? So it improved innovation beyond what natural market forces would have produced. It forced technology development. It spurred innovation. There are obviously criticisms of CAFE as well. It's not a widely beloved or like uniformly beloved policy. People were worried that if cars are more fuel efficient, people might be incentivized to drive more, right? If they can get more out of a tank of gas, they might change their behavior and start driving more. And that is true to a small extent, that the environmental benefits of increased fuel efficiency are offset by about 10 to 20% as a result of this rebound effect, but it definitely by no means completely offsets it. And that having these kind of standards is a much more economically inefficient way of doing things than, say, like a fuel tax, right? But the fact is that it may well be less economically efficient, but I can tell you CAFE standards are more politically popular than a fuel tax would ever be, right? And so that was also part of it as well, is the politics and the economics meeting here. And the results are clear, right? So the fuel efficiency was about 5.5 per gallon. You consumed 5.5 gallons for every 100 miles you drove in the late 1970s. And today, you consume about 3.5 gallons per 100 miles you drive. So how would you apply this to the fertilizer industry? Well, we outlined two possible approaches, right? you could either mandate increased a percentage of enhanced efficiency fertilizers in total nitrogen fertilizer sales. So what does that mean? It means that currently about 10% of US corn cropland uses enhanced efficiency fertilizers. If you were to say to the fertilizer industry, you need to make sure that of the fertilizer you sell, by the year 2020, it needs to be 20% of the fertilizer you sell needs to be these enhanced efficiency fertilizers. And then by 2030, it needs to be 30% or 50%. So putting the onus on them to make sure that there is an increase in product sales. How do you do that? Well, through both information campaigns for farmers, but also lowering the price of these products to a more satisfactory price level, a more affordable price level. Or another approach would be to put the onus on achieving a specific level of nitrogen use efficiency on the fertilizer industry. To say, okay, if you sell a certain product, an enhanced efficiency fertilizer, you need to show that the use of this product leads to a 20% increase in nitrogen use efficiency in this particular type of crop and climate, for example. So a major benefit of either of these approaches would be added incentives for manufacturers to generate information that helps to identify the best conditions for the use of enhanced efficiency fertilizers and spur the development of more effective products. Doing so wouldn't just increase the environmental effectiveness of enhanced efficiency fertilizers, but also their economic return. And we talk about it in detail. I don't have time to go into detail here, but if you're interested, we can talk about it in the Q&A or afterwards, about taking inspiration from the biofuel mandate, specifically the renewable fuel standards, as an inspiration for how such a policy might be implemented. And this kind of idea of a policy is not completely new. It's been implemented before in India, where there the government mandated 3 years ago that every single granule of urea that's sold in India has to be coated with this oil called neem oil, which is a delayed release fertilizer. It's an enhanced efficiency fertilizer. The incentive for this was not purely environmental, right? 1% of India's GDP every year goes towards fertilizer subsidies. So they wanted to find a way to both reduce the weight of those subsidies, but also a large amount of highly subsidized urea goes to non-agricultural uses. It's been used as an adhesive in industrial applications. And so by coating it with neem, it made it completely useless in these other applications and made it solely okay to use in agricultural settings. It's still too early to know how effective this policy has been, but it's something I'm going to be keeping my eye on, and it's something that it will also set the tone for how perhaps practical or how successful policies in other countries might be. So I'll just getting to the end now of the talk where we talk about the case study that we looked at. We specifically looked at the US corn sector to evaluate what would the economic impact be of implementing such a policy where you mandate the fertilizer industry to increase the sales of these more enhanced efficiency fertilizer products in the mold of the CAFE standards, right? And so we looked at 3 scenarios. We looked at a business as usual scenario where the amount of enhanced efficiency fertilizer use in the sector stays constant to 2030, which we thought was a pretty generous extrapolation of current trends where it stayed constant pretty much over the past 20 years. Then we looked at one scenario which we deemed kind of moderate ambition, where that enhanced efficiency fertilizer use increased to 30% by 2030, and then a more high ambition scenario where half of the fertilizer that's applied, and I should say it was just the portion of the US corn sector where there was particularly excessive nitrogen use. So about 1/3 of the US corn sector where there's particularly excessive nitrogen use, and we can go into more detail about how we define that. And so here, briefly, are the results of this. We looked at both the fertilizer industry, the environment, and then these are the farmers, the panels C and D here. But essentially, we showed that in both scenario 1 and 2, this is fertilizer industry profits here. Fertilizer industry could actually increase their profit margins above a business as usual scenario if they are selling a higher proportion of these enhanced efficiency fertilizers, right? Because we have data on the profit margins, the production costs of these new products, as well as the prices that they usually sell them at, right? And so we could show that those profit margins would actually increase in both scenarios over time. We also showed for farmers that because these enhanced efficiency fertilizers have been shown on average to increase yields slightly, so they'd be able to increase their income from corn as a result of using these products, but obviously there'd also be an increase in the amount of in their fertilizer costs because they have to pay a bit more for these new fertilizers. But overall, the increased income from the yield increases outweighs the fertilizer costs. Obviously, there are massive uncertainties here because there are also massive uncertainties when it comes, or not massive, but there's a lot of heterogeneity when it comes to the impacts of these enhanced efficiency fertilizers when it comes to their use on different climates and crops. And so part of this policy idea is to spur more research and more innovation in these products. And so this was for scenario, sorry, I should say this was for scenario 1 for farmers, and this is scenario 2, so the more ambitious. So in both cases, you have the corn income that's, that outweighs the increased cost of the fertilizer use. And then this here, this panel up here is the environmental benefits of this policy. Now you can also see the scales are different. So the environmental benefits from avoided nitrogen pollution significantly outweigh any of the economic impacts to farmers and the fertilizer industry. But the avoided nitrogen pollution from avoided nitrate leaching, avoided ammonia emissions, avoided nitrous oxide emissions vastly outweighs these economic impacts. But there is a potential for a sweet spot here where you can get both the environmental benefits with the fertilizer industry increasing their profit margin and farmers saving money. So this is what I started with. So we've covered pretty much, hopefully, all these bullets here where nitrogen is both essential to life and a major environmental problem. So we need to figure out how we manage our complicated relationship with nitrogen. But unfortunately, the policies that we currently have in place to deal with the most significant source of nitrogen pollution, agriculture, tend to be ineffective because they're focused on changing farmer behavior, and that's a really difficult thing to do. So we need to be more creative when it comes to thinking about new policy options to deal with nitrogen pollution. And so one way to think about it is to change your focus from to another actor in the agricultural supply chain, which for us was the fertilizer industry, and take inspiration from the CAFE standards. And how could the CAFE standards be applied to the fertilizer industry? We discussed briefly ways that that could be done, and the fact that it could spur innovation in an otherwise conservative sector, and that overall the net economic benefit of doing such a thing, even just in a small portion of the US corn sector, a third of the corn sector, could generate economic benefits of $5 to $8 billion by 2030. Thanks again for listening. I also want to thank, it's a family affair today. My parents have come in, and my wife and 3-month-old daughter. She's been asking some questions, I know, in the back there, but she was good enough to wait till the answer session, so that's great. So thank you, and happy to take any questions.
So can you tell us a little bit more about neem?
Yeah.
It sounds wonderful. What's known about any potential adverse effects, either environmentally or on public health, during this new, whatever it is?
That's a really good question. On neem itself, I'm not an expert. I know that with other coatings of fertilizer, fertilizer industry has evaluated them. They haven't been independently evaluated as much. Some enhanced efficiency fertilizers, some of the most popular ones, there's a nitrification inhibitor that's the most popularly used one, have been deemed non-toxic and by the various standards that evaluate those sort of things. But clearly, the massive increase in the use of this, kind of neem-coated oil might have some unintended impacts that I don't know that India is necessarily, that's a priority right now for them. But I know that it has been, this is not a new product. It's been used widely before its kind of mandated introduction now. So it has been studied for a while. But unfortunately, I don't have more information than that. I'm sorry.
I can speak a bit on it. I'm from India. Neem is it's a local tree, I would say. It's a local bush. and this has been used in the medicines, Ayurvedic medicines, if you know of, for a long time, and neem oil is used for, it's considered as a better and a healthy way of, the neem soaps are very popular, that's what I meant to say. Neem oil is very popular. So I think most of the studies on neem so far has been that it's beneficial. It doesn't have any negative impact on environment, and it is also good for human consumption. That's what I would say. It's something which has been going on for a lot of time. Yeah. I just had a question. Can I ask?
Of course.
When we say about nitrogen, there's the issue that the pollution also impacts the water, and that has negative consequences on health. So, is there any movement on enumerating those negative impacts on people who are using that water and maybe using that as a nudge for?
Yeah. So when we estimated the environmental benefits of such a policy, which is the top right-hand quadrant here, we include the estimates of the damage that nitrate does includes the health impacts, right? So the increased risk of colon cancer, blue baby syndrome, those kind of things. Also the impacts on fisheries, right? Now I should say that these damage estimates are still in their early days, right? And any kind of attempt to put a monetary value on an environmental damage, we could debate that for a long time. But there are efforts to include these human health impacts as well, yes. Yeah.
I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about inefficiencies that might come up in your proposed solution of targeting the policies to the fertilizer producers.
Are you thinking of any in particular?
No, I'm just a open question. I mean, you mentioned that one of the criticisms of this form of policy was inefficiency in the automotive industry, and I wonder what
well, so one risk that we actually explored in a paper a few years ago is that these products have been shown in many cases to increase yield, right? And so if you use an enhanced efficiency fertilizer and it increases your yield, you may be incentivized to apply more of that nitrogen than you otherwise would have done because you think that's going to get you a yield bump. And that's akin to this rebound effect that you saw in the CAFE standards where more fuel-efficient cars, I want to drive more because I can get more from my tank of gas. Our response to that, at least, I mean, we try to address as many issues as we can. Our response to that is, look, when you look at, for example, where the US is on the yield response curve right now in terms of how much yield it's getting from the amount of nitrogen it's applying, it's pretty much at the plateau. And so applying more nitrogen is not going to get you that much more yield. So the potential for a significant rebound effect of that nature would not be possible. Well, it would be, sorry, I rephrase that. I don't think there is a high risk of that. The other inefficiency that comes to mind is through one of the ways that you could implement this policy by mandating increases in the proportion of the percentage of enhanced efficiency fertilizers that are included in total fertilizer sales. By doing that, that might not be a way to say spur innovation because you're just saying increase the sales proportion of these products, right? That's why we also include the nitrogen use efficiency standards and keep making the industry liable for those because that would probably be more of a spur to innovate than just a product standard. But that could be an inefficiency as well, designing it so that you could really force technology development. It's an inherently conservative industry when you compare it to, say, other agrochemical industries that invest about 10 to 20% of their revenue into R&D. From our calculations, fertilizer industry invests about 0.1 to 0.2% of their revenue in R&D, which makes sense when you think about it because nitrogen's never going to go out of style, right? And you're never going to have to innovate with nitrogen. Plants are always going to need it, and they like it in its most basic form, so it's fine. So there needs to be some nudge somewhere. That's the kind of ultimate premise. There needs to be some nudge to force that development. Yeah, at the back there.
Could you speak a little more about why you found the profits of the fertilizer industry to go up? Because profits are difference between revenue and cost. Is the cost of producing these high-use or highly effective nitrogen fertilizers?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Because on the revenue side,
In the first slide before, you said that you want to actually charge a lower price
Yeah.
to get farmers to be able to adopt that.
So no, so it's a good question. So as part of actually my PhD research here is really, the industry isn't going to openly admit what their profit margins are on these chemicals, right? So part of my PhD research was trying to get a best understanding as we can of that profit margin, right? So I did survey of industry experts to get a set of people that worked in these companies that understood the production costs and understood what the retail value of these things were to get an understanding of what the profit margin was. And yes, there is an increase in production costs of these chemicals, but they can also sell them at higher prices. And that delta is actually higher for these new products than it is the delta for the traditional products. So there might be a 5 to 10% increase in production costs, but they can charge 20 to 25% more for these products, right? And then when it comes to farmer affordability, so India is actually a good example, which you probably couldn't do given the political dynamic in the States. Industry are only allowed to charge a 5% premium on neem-coated urea. That's it. And that's mandated by the government, right? We don't go into detail about what exactly the kind of price point would have to be for both farmers to save money. I actually do that in a paper from a couple of years ago, but both in the US and China. But I think that's what you're getting at, right? Like at what price point would it be affordable to farmers and profitable for industry? And I can send you the paper that I did that came out of my PhD 3 years ago that kind of gets into trying to find that range. But yeah, there was a question in the middle there, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. This is fantastic. It's always great to see a successful step. So I have 2 questions.
For now. Successful for now. We'll see.
I have 2 quick questions. The first, I'd love to hear just a little bit about the failed types of incentives that haven't yet really been successful in terms of trying to cause a decrease in nitrogen use from farmers, and kinds of individual-based incentives that people might learn from trying to apply incentives in other areas. And the second question is about what kind of farmer behaviors you think might, other than affordability, might prevent some of the adoption of these high-use efficiency products. Basically, are they as easy to apply and use? Are they technologically challenging to use farmers, or do you see there being a real challenge there?
So that's a really good question. So generally with these technologies, the idea is that the knowledge is embedded in the product, right? So that farmers don't really need to change their behavior. They just apply these products the same way that they applied the old products, and it does the work for them. Now, that being said, there's also been evidence to show that they're even more effective when combined with best management practices. So you shouldn't evaluate any one of these things as an individual thing. Ideally, they would be combined. In terms of other hurdles, I was talking about this with Professor Sokolow before. In the same survey from Michigan that showed the little use of these practices and technologies, they also had a question of who do you listen to? Who do you take advice from, right? And the top 2 were fertilizer dealers and my neighbors. And right at the bottom were university extension agents and government officials, right? So that's also kind of, in retrospect, one of the motivations of this work, that if these new products are coming from the fertilizer industry, and some of these industries are vertically integrated, some of the companies are vertically integrated, they have fertilizer dealers on the ground, right? They might have a better way of communicating and convincing farmers of the utility of these products than others. And then finally, I don't want to make it seem like these, I have meta-analysis stuff afterwards, which if there were questions on that, but these products currently aren't a silver bullet, right? They work really well in some places in terms of reducing nitrogen losses and increasing yields and improving nitrogen use efficiency, and not particularly well in other places. And part of the reason for proposing this approach is to force technology development in this sector, to make better products, to make products that are better suited to certain climates and crops, so that they do become more useful strategies in reducing nitrogen pollution. I'm not sure if I addressed all your points, but hopefully. There was a question in the back, and then Denise. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was wondering how you can motivate policymakers to push forward such progress? Because the Cascade standard, for example, itself was created because there was this imminent energy crisis. But for nitrogen, because it's a multitude issue, so it's kind of hard to motivate policymakers to really push forward for such regulation.
So that's a really good question. That ties in with another paper, the last paper I had before this, which was making the case that actually dealing with nitrogen pollution is the climate strategy for the Trump era. And the rationale is that what we're looking for, what we should look for in climate strategies today, is that the local benefits vastly outweigh the international ones, right? So, for example, with nitrogen pollution, if you reduce agricultural nitrogen pollution, you get some climate benefits because nitrous oxide is a really important greenhouse gas. But the air and water quality benefits vastly outweigh it. The local, regional benefits vastly outweigh it, right? The things that people can see immediately and that affect their own personal well-being immediately. Nitrogen is a great example of that ratio of local to international being massive. And so in this era of kind of increased economic nationalism and putting country first and kind of to hell with the international order, those kind of policies, I would argue, have more, are perhaps more politically feasible than ones that are kind of trying to be international. And I think the second point is that the argument we're trying to make is that this is a market opportunity for fertilizer industry, right? There is a potential for them to profit from this regulation, as opposed to, say, Exxon in response to climate change, where it was clear the only feasible way, if you're going to get off fossil fuels, is for Exxon to either completely transform its business model or to go out of business, right? And that's not a way you're going to get them on board. Whereas fertilizer industry, starting to have discussions with fertilizer companies and international fertilizer trade associations, and there is an understanding that they're going to have to change at some point. They're very, again, conservative and slow-moving, but to convince them of this market opportunity, and then that is, I think, once they get that business signal to policymakers, that might also be a way to convince. Denise and then Rob.
So I think this is a great example of thinking really practically, using science to inform a policy recommendation. But what I'm wondering is, if you thought about the politics of this at all, does this require federal legislation that then gets implemented by something like the U.S. Department of Agriculture? Is there an opportunity in Europe to do something like this? Is there more of a sort of political willingness to make something like this happen, sort of either at the European Union level or at individual national levels? Could you imagine this happening at the state level, at certain states within the U.S., for example, like California, as part of their effort to meet greenhouse gas reductions that they've committed to?
Yeah, so in initial conversations with policymakers about this, it's, at least in the US, it's clear that it would probably be best to start at the state level, right? For a couple of reasons, both because it's more politically feasible given the current political environment, but also because states are going to better know what the agricultural layout of their state looks like. And so we'll be able to kind of tailor these kind of policies to, what is best for their state. As for what could work in other countries, the EU is different because they do have policies that mandate changes in farmer behavior on the environment. And the nitrates directive, for example, has been somewhat effective. It could be much more effective, but there are definitely we explored the US for two reasons. One, because of the ineffectiveness of current policies, and two, because of the makeup of the current fertilizer industry was highly concentrated, which, from looking at previous environmental policy examples, seemed to be an important precondition for the fact that it was highly concentrated and that the major players also made these alternatives was an important precondition for this policy to work. But there's no reason it couldn't be applied in a place like China or elsewhere. Rob.
I think that'll be our last question.
Okay.
So three quick ones. At the state level, you have still a issue. Farmer providers provide fertilizer in the state. It seems to me we have a hard time. The subsidies were not really emphasized, but I think an economist would say that problem number one is less so less. When you say 1% of GDP in India is fertilizer subsidy, puts the pressure, put the kinds of pressures on it, which shrink the subsidy, not the tax, which is different, I guess. The subsidies are really large, and in the energy curiosity, on those damaged functions, you actually smooth out, you have hit at all the components of the sun. And if you were to tell us how big what the two biggest ones were, when you decided on a central estimate, is it greenhouse tiny?
Greenhouse is 1%
That,
of that chunk. Nitrate, the avoided nitrate pollution is about 80%. Yeah, which is water. And then air quality is about 15 to 19, and then which goes back to my argument that this is a climate strategy for the post-Trump era, in the sense that the benefits are almost entirely local.
nitrate in water is what?
It depends who. There are several estimates for it. We use a combination of different estimates because they're a bit. But you either can estimate the damage to fisheries as a result, or you can estimate the increased healthcare costs that come from treating people that have been affected by increased nitrate levels in water. You can even try to estimate, put a monetary estimate on the decrease in recreational activities that come from increased algae blooms. Right? So this is quite a young field, at least in this particular area. And there's a lot of debate around it, so that's why we kind of try to take a bunch of different estimates that do estimate them in different ways. But in all of those estimates that try to put a number on different types of nitrogen pollution, nitrate is always the biggest per kilo. And then in terms of the subsidies, you're right, that in certain countries, that's in China and India particularly, subsidies is the big issue, and reducing those subsidies is probably one of the biggest nitrogen policies you could put in place. That being said, both those countries have pretty powerful central governments, right? The fact that India could just say 100% of our urea is going to be coated with neem, right? China could do something similar, right? And they've also committed to peaking their fertilizer consumption by 2020, which I think they already peaked this year. So those powerful central governments can also do things. And I forget your second question, but yes. And then spillover in states, we haven't explored that deeply, but it's very true. We were actually, on a separate note, we were looking, for example, in another paper on the implementation of Denmark's fat tax. And one reason where they taxed fatty foods, and one reason it didn't work is because people would just drive over the bridge to Sweden. And so it's very true that could be a spillover. You'd have to somehow deal with that in terms of how you implement it, for sure. Thank you. Those were really great questions. I really enjoyed being back here, and thanks for your attention.